Ranger Taylor.
And I'm Ranger Shannon.
And welcome to Vicksburg National Military Park's virtual Independence Day celebration. We are so thrilled that you have chosen to join us today to dive a little deeper into the local history here on this, the 157th anniversary of the surrender and siege of Vicksburg. Today we're going to be learning about the civilian experience, particularly their time spent living in caves and adjusting to a life in crisis.
So if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comment section below. As the video shows, we'll be able to respond virtually to any comments or questions you might have from the safety of air conditioning.
Excellent. So first, we just want to start off by asking you a question. Have you ever had to make the best out of a bad situation? I mean, if you think about it, we're kind of all doing that right now. Quarantine, pandemic, ring a bell to anybody? For the better part of 2 months, most of us were forced to shelter in place in our homes. Now, I'm sure a lot of us chose to put a positive spin on that, whether it be the opportunity to spend more time with your loved ones. Perhaps you binge watched a television show that you were waiting to watch. Maybe you baked something and cooked something, just learned something new. For the most part, I'd imagine, besides those trips to the grocery store for toilet paper, that you had a pretty peaceful experience. But now imagine sheltering in place at your home, and day and night you have artillery shells bombarding your city and falling all around you. During the siege of Vicksburg, this is what civilians had to live through and experience, and they had to adjust to a life of crisis and find the normal in the abnormal, not unlike we've had to do the past few months.
But before we go any further, let's do a recap of that crisis, the siege of Vicksburg. Dubbed by President Abraham Lincoln as the Key, Vicksburg was the last major Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River. Capturing Vicksburg would mean restoring the Mississippi River to Union control and effectively splitting the Confederacy in half. Now, in May 1863, after several failed attempts to take Vicksburg, Union General Ulysses S. Grant decided to lay siege to the town. Vicksburg would endure a 47-day siege that saw fear, hopelessness, and death.
So when we think of Civil War battlefields, we often think of large expanses of land out in the countryside. These scenes of private, isolated, bloody battles occurring on flat, pristine land miles away from civilization or any of the comforts that it can offer. But Vicksburg's story is different in that it takes place within a city, directly affecting its civilians as much, maybe even more, than the troops stationed there. At the time of the siege of Vicksburg, there were approximately 4,000 civilians and roughly 32,000 Confederate troops living in the city. Both groups were subject to constant cannon fire that would drive even the most level-headed man or woman to be absolutely riddled with consuming anxieties.
Over 22,000 artillery shells and mortars were fired into the town during the siege of Vicksburg. Now, many of those shells are coming from the Union Navy stationed on the Mississippi River, while the rest are coming from Union artillery on the siege lines. Though the siege lines were a considerable distance from the city center, artillery shells could be fired over 2 miles, directly affecting Vicksburg civilians. The wife of a Confederate soldier, Mary Loughborough, states in her memoir, My Life in a Cave, that resting in Vicksburg seemed like resting near a volcano. The constant bombardment put the civilians in the crosshairs and left Vicksburg to fate's mercy.
So by this point, you're probably wondering, why didn't the civilians just leave before the siege began? And the answer is pretty simple. They had significant faith in the 9 Confederate fortifications that were guarding the entrance to the city. Additionally, they had faith in the Confederate troops that they were going to protect them and keep the Union out. And they also did not want to leave their homes or their possessions on the off chance that the Union did take the city. They wanted their stuff still. So for their protection, civilians began digging caves. The porous, loess, or loess soil that is prominent down here in the Mississippi Delta allowed for the easy digging and carving out of these caves, and it also allowed them to be very sturdy structures. Some caves were large and elaborate, about as elaborate as a hole in the earth can be, while others were small, simple structures. Some dug the caves themselves, and others would pay somebody to dig it, and of course, that just depended on how much money you had. In fact, Mary Loughborough writes in her memoir that, quote, caves were the fashion, the rage over besieged Vicksburg, end quote. She talks about caves in Vicksburg as if they're the hottest couture fashion coming out of Paris, France at the time.
Well, speaking of fashion, caves had a lot of different style variations. Some were Y-shaped, some were T-shaped, some were communal caves, and some were private caves. But they all seem to have space for both common areas and a bedroom or two. They carved notches into the walls to place candles, as well as platforms to be used as beds or seating areas. Vicksburgers wanted to make their time spent in caves as comfortable as possible, so most of them brought their personal belongings along with them into the cave. Things such as mirrors, rugs, chairs, beds, and cookware. Children also brought with them toys, games, and musical instruments to keep themselves entertained.
But despite trying to make this area as comfortable as possible, several residents, such as Emma Balfour, note the horrid, suffocating, tomb-like conditions of these caves. Amongst the smell and the heat, citizens of Vicksburg who resided in these caves had to endure such things as mosquitoes, snakes, other creatures, and even the elements. In fact, for these reasons and others, a lot of Vicksburg civilians thought the caves to be more dangerous than the open air, and they took their chances outside of the caves. Mary Loughborough writes in her memoir that during an artillery bombardment, she chose, rather than go into the cave for protection, to grab her child and huddle underneath a fig tree for protection. A fig tree, you guys. She chose a tree over a cave. That is how much several of these civilians did not trust the safety of these earthen caves.
I can't imagine.
Me neither.
However, it didn't take civilians long to realize that they needed to accept the slight risk of being buried alive as opposed to the much greater risk of being hit with an artillery projectile. Though they had finally embraced the protection that their caves provided, they still lived in fear. Mary Loughborough describes the fear that she experienced while living in her cave. Terror-stricken, we crouched in the cave, while shell after shell followed each other in quick succession. I endeavored by constant prayer to prepare myself for the sudden death I was almost certain awaited me. My heart stood still as we heard the reports from the guns and the rushing and fearful sound of the shell as it came towards us. As it neared, the noise became deafening. The air was full of the rushing sound. Pains darted through my temples. My ears were full of shock, leaving me in a quiet state of terror, the most painful I can imagine. Cowering in a corner, holding my child to my heart, the only feeling of my life being the choking throbs of my heart that rendered me almost breathless.
That's so powerful and such an indication of the mentally challenging time that these people were going through. But they not only had to battle mentally, but they also had to take care of themselves physically as well in the day-to-day life. And in particular, food was something that became very hard to come by. As the siege of Vicksburg wore on, a food scarcity happened. Now, at the beginning, sources indicate that most civilians in Vicksburg had pretty steady diets that consisted of light bread, cornbread and bacon, beef and milk, provided your cow hadn't been terminated by any artillery fire, and also fruits and vegetables that they could find in gardens. But as the siege wore on, by the end of it, civilians were eating pea meal, like the soldiers were, cornmeal, mule meat, and drinking dirty river water. Mary Loughborough talks about how several wild dogs in town would attack as people were cooking their dinners, but that eventually, as the food shortage wore on, these dogs began mysteriously disappearing. Take that for what you will.
Towards the end of the siege, some residents developed a blasé attitude towards the constant threat of injury and death. In fact, Mary Loughborough states, "After one is accustomed to the change, we do not mind it, but becoming accustomed, that is the trial." The constant bombardment, sounds, reverberations, the altered diets and activities combined with the overwhelming anxieties became their new normal.
Celebrated American author Mark Twain visited Vicksburg in the years following the siege to interview survivors. He came to the town and noted that after 6 weeks of constant bombardment, it, quote, wore the novelty all out. They got used to being bomb-shelled out of home and into the ground. The matter became commonplace, end quote. Twain interviews a survivor who talks about making a game out of the artillery shells that are being lobbed into town. When they would hear the cannon go off, they would try to guess what shell was heading towards them before it exploded. Additionally, in a particularly interesting story, he interviewed a man who, after Sunday service, had run into one of his friends during the siege and invited his friend over to his place or his cave dwelling to enjoy a dram of whiskey. Now, whiskey was particularly hard to come by during the siege, so this was a pretty big deal that he was inviting him over to share in what he had. The guy accepted, and they were saying goodbye and shaking hands, and as they went to shake hands, he's holding his hand, an artillery shell blows up in front of them, and he's left holding just the hand and arm of his friend that he had just invited over. But such injuries were so commonplace for them at the time, and they had such a disconnect from what was happening, that the gentleman remembers his only thought he had as he's holding this arm is, at least the whiskey is safe. Wow.
Others, like Emma Balfour, would lose their anxieties and make peace with the situation. She notes in her diary, quote, "We have spent the last 2 nights in a cave, but tonight I think we will stay home. It is not safe, I know, for the shells are falling all around us, but I hope none may strike us. I slept at home almost soundly after commending my soul and body to my Heavenly Father," end quote. Death surrounded the citizens of Vicksburg, along with the unthinkable injuries to the soldiers on the front lines. Citizens were victim to injury as well. Several accounts detail children playing in the street with unexploded shot moments before it would detonate. Other accounts discuss mortar shells exploding in front of and above these earthen tubes, collapsing them. Some families were able to dig their way out, others weren't so lucky. In another heart-wrenching story, Mary Loughborough remembers a mother's screams when her child was crushed within a cave when a mortar shell fell through the roof.
It's terrible. And yet, despite the constant threat of danger that these civilians endured, civilian casualties are surprisingly low. Officially, only about 12 people are known to have been killed, and approximately 50 were injured. So this low casualty number can likely be attributed to the caves. So even though they were absolutely miserable to be in, they ultimately saved lives.
On the 48th day of the siege, July 4th, the Confederates surrendered and the Union Army marched into Vicksburg. Finally liberated from their caves, civilians emerged to find peace restored to their once besieged city. Although events did not transpire as they would have hoped, some civilians expressed gratitude at the overwhelming sense of peace. They could once again embrace their independence, but that freedom would look different with the Union occupying their city.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today for our virtual Independence Day celebration. We hope you enjoyed learning a little bit more about the civilian experience here at Vicksburg.
Happy 4th of July!
Happy 4th of July!